I'm recording my homily for the last Sunday in Ordinary Time, which is the feast day of Christ the King. And so I'm going to just be reflecting a little bit on that. So the gospel this year for the feast day of Christ the King is Jesus is on the cross, right? And so Jesus is on the cross, which is, if we as Christians, we would say this is his throne, right? This is, if there ever was an earthly throne for Jesus, it is the cross. And he has two criminals being crucified with him. I'm going to talk a little bit about them and the connection with that. You know, it's very interesting. Maybe about 2 months ago, Bishop Daniel Muggenberg, one of our auxiliary bishops, gave us a class in preparation for the next liturgical year where we're going to be reading through the Gospel of Matthew every Sunday. And so it was just a class just to kind of give us a little refresher on the Gospel of Matthew. And one of the things that he said was that from Matthew, Jesus is not just a king. He's not just an earthly king. So if you were to go back many, many hundreds of years before the time of Jesus, the Jewish people have this moment where they feel very intimidated by all these earthly kingdoms around them, these earthly rulers. They have strong kings, strong kingdoms. And so they go to God and they say, God, give us an earthly king. Give us a king. And God's response to that was to be insulted, quite honestly. And he's like, am I not good enough for you? And they said, give us an earthly king. Give us a king who will be strong and courageous and lead us in battle. And God says to them, okay, but you're going to have to suffer the consequences of having an earthly king. There's going to be corruption. He's going to tax you. He's going to do all these things. He's going to take your sons into the army, and your sons are going to die in battle and all this. And they said, give us an earthly king. So from that moment on, the Jewish people didn't need to have as much faith, because to follow a divine king, a God king, one must have complete faith. Jesus comes, and for Matthew, Jesus is the return of this God king. He's the return to this kingdom where it requires absolute faith to be able to follow. It's a different kind of kingdom. During Jesus' time, the zealots, there were people who wanted to restore Israel's earthly glory, take over lands, and Jesus is like, no, that's not going to be the way it is. We're not going to be that way. Now, some attributes. So there's that moment where Jesus is talking with Pontius Pilate. You remember that moment where they're talking about his kingdom or his role as a king? And Pilate's trying to understand what he's getting at, because Pilate is a representative of the Roman kingdom, the Roman Empire. And Jesus says, my kingdom is not of this world. If it were, my attendants would be fighting for me. It's not of this world. And so there is something otherworldly about Jesus' kingdom. He's a king, he comes as God to be our king, to restore that kingdom. Now, lest we become off balance, Jesus also reminds us that that same kingdom is here. It's not about land, it's not about water per se. All of that belongs to God, right? All of this, it all belongs to God in the end. Earthly kingdoms come and go. But Jesus' kingdom is for something else. It's a kingdom of souls. So whenever there's spiritual battle, it's a battle for souls. Whenever we say we have an enemy, we don't really have an enemy, because they are a soul. And so they are one whom we desire to bring back into our kingdom if they've left it. Right? It's a different kind of kingdom. But all the parables say, it is here. We're not just supposed to be here on earth just to relax, right? We fight for his kingdom here on earth as well. You know, a while back, maybe, I don't know, a year ago, and it's ongoing, the relationship with the Catholic Church and China, the Chinese government, which is a communist state, has been very contentious, has been very difficult, and for many years the Catholic Church has been underground and operating in secret. And the reason for that is because the government wants to control what the Catholic Church does. So when you have governments that are like that, it's because they operate out of an incredible insecurity. They're so afraid They're afraid of this divine kingdom being present because they can't control it. They can try, but they really in the end can't. Now, Pope Francis is taking a different take in China. He's trying to work with the government. And I'm not going to necessarily comment on that, but if I were to step back and say, we have these two kingdoms, you have these earthly kingdoms, and then you have Jesus' kingdom, why would a government ever think that they should have some say? Like, for example, in choosing bishops. Why would the government ever think that they have any level of competency, or why would they even desire to pick the next shepherd for a particular diocese? Well, we know why. It's fear, right? That's why. You know, someday I would love to go to China. I think that country is a fascinating country. I would love to go there someday. You know, one of the things that people always go to see when they're there is the Great Wall, right? So they build this enormous, 1,000-mile wall in order to protect their territory, to protect their lands, right? And that's understandable. Why did they build the wall? Fear. Fear of the people on the other side of the wall, fear of invading armies, wanting to protect their people. Who knows, you know? That's why we build walls. And so Jesus' kingdom is different. It doesn't need walls, per se. What we need is faith to be part of it, right? The other day I was trying to get my I've been trying to get my passport renewed, and you know, you got these steps you have to follow to get your passport renewed, which makes total sense, right? That's the part of us being able to travel from nation to nation and all of that. I let my passport expire. But as a Catholic, as Christians, what is our passport? It's our baptism, right? We can go anywhere. We can go anywhere and be living our faith, right? This is so important, is if we're living in the state of grace, if we're living our faith fully, and we're accepting our citizenship of heaven, because that's what it means to be part of Jesus' kingdom, is we are citizens of the faith here on earth, but also in heaven, is that we can go anywhere in the world. You can go to the underground church in China, you can go to Bolivia, you can go to Brazil, you can go to Russia, you can go to, I'm just throwing countries out here, Italy. You can go to Mass in any of those countries, and you can receive the body and blood of Jesus Christ. Right? Our passport is our baptism. We can go anywhere in Jesus' kingdom. About 500 years ago, there was a king, King Henry VIII in England, who decided that he wanted to become the head of the church, the Catholic Church in England. And so he made a royal decree that he was then now the head of the Catholic Church in England. And he demanded that all the bishops would recognize that. And obviously the Pope did not, and the bishops were not supposed to, right? But the bishops were all afraid of losing their heads because the penalty was death to reject it, or imprisonment, and eventually perhaps death. And so all the bishops in England went along with it because they didn't want to die. All except one, St. John Fisher, right? He was the only bishop who said, nope, not going with it. I'm not going to follow a lie just because I'm afraid of losing my head, right? So this is the difference between a country that operates out of security and a country that operates out of fear. And the same true as us of living our faith. Do we do so out of fear, or do we do so out of love, out of security? But the point I bring that up was actually for St. Thomas More. St. Thomas More was the Chancellor of England. He was a layman, he was a lawyer, he was the number 2 man in the kingdom, because whenever the king wanted something done, St. Thomas More was the one who was able to make that happen. Very smart, very competent, a great guy. But when the king does this, he can't follow that. And so there's this moment where his family is worried that he's going to be executed or be imprisoned. And he said to his family, don't worry, I'm not one of those superhero saints. I'm not going to be a martyr. And he thought he could kind of work it out, you know, while at the same time following his conscience. And that didn't happen. And so when they're at that day where they're going to execute him, he says one last phrase. He says, "I am the king's good servant, but God's first." The king's good servant, but God's first. If there's ever those moments where our own kingdom, our own government, would expect us to follow a path that deviates from God's kingdom, then we can say that. We must say that. If there's ever a time when our government wants us to abandon our faith or to sell our faith or to make our faith be secondary, we say, absolutely not. There's only one answer to that, right? Absolutely not. God's first. God's kingdom is first. We just had a feast day for Blessed Miguel Pro. He was a very young Jesuit when the Mexican Revolution happened about 100 years ago, 1920s. And he was studying for the priesthood at the time. He was in formation, but it became very difficult because after the revolution, the government says that it's now basically illegal to be Catholic. And so it begins to force all the Catholic priests either to go underground, to stop being priests, or to flee, or to die for the faith. And so they send the young Jesuits to California, the United States, to study for a while. Then they go to Europe for a while. And when he finishes studies and he's ordained a priest, he wants to go back to Mexico. And him and his superiors, they know what that means, right? Because, you know, in the seminary, they don't give us a class on how to engage in espionage. And they probably should. But they don't teach us how to be spies. And so eventually, whenever we're in these situations where the government thinks that it can come down over and above the Catholic Church, priests have to engage in espionage. We have to go underground. And we're just not very good at it. We get caught. So eventually he comes back to Mexico and he gets caught. And they charge him up with some trumped up charges, something like that, you know. But then there's a day when he's going to be executed, and they want to make an example of him. So they decide to publicize his execution, and they take pictures of it. They put the pictures in the newspapers. They put it everywhere. They want everybody to see him die, because they want to make him an example. And so by making him an example, their thinking was, well, you know what, then the Catholic Church will cease to exist and everybody will live in fear, and that's how they're going to conquer the church. So they begin to do that. But at the day of his execution, so he's in front of the firing squad. They're going to shoot him. And he has one last phrase. And he says, "Viva Cristo Rey. Long live Christ the King." Right? He was a Mexican citizen. He loved his country. He loved his people. But God's first. But God is first. Now, it's always interesting. They should probably put this in a manual for all extreme dictators, right? For all overbearing dictators. That if you're going to persecute the Catholic Church, you're going to fail. Because it does the exact opposite of what they intend every single time. It does the exact opposite. I know it sounds bad, but I say, as Catholics, we're kind of like cockroaches. You'll never get rid of us. The harder you try, the stronger we actually get. So, over 100,000 people came to Blessed Miguel Pro's funeral. It backfires, right? So Jesus is on the cross. And one thief, one criminal turns to him and basically says, if you've got the power, why don't you come down on these kingdoms? Why don't you demonstrate your earthly power? Why don't you save us, right? And he didn't mean going to heaven. He doesn't care about heaven. So he can go back to a life of crime. Jesus doesn't even answer him. Doesn't even respond to him. Doesn't that seem like how it's kind of what he does with the world. When the world does evil, doesn't even respond to it. But the other criminal turns to Jesus and he says, Jesus, I want to be part of your kingdom. I want to be part of your kingdom. And Jesus' response is beautiful. He offers mercy like that. I can't snap when I got gloves on, right? He offers mercy just like that. I guess that's the beauty of confession, is we offer mercy just like that, right? The assumption being that that person, just like the criminal who was next to Jesus, wants to be forgiven. They want to change. They want to be part of the kingdom, which means they want that kingdom to be first in their life. And Jesus says, today you will be with me in paradise. Isn't it interesting? He doesn't make it kind of abstract like, oh yeah, today you'll be in section 52 over in heaven. You know, he doesn't say that. He says, you will be with me. You will be with me in paradise. It's very beautiful. I bring up a lot of this just to remind us of the tensions that we live in, living here on earth. But at the same time, there's really no debate. If we're going to be Catholics, if we're going to be Christians, then God is first. All right. I hope you have a wonderful Thanksgiving, spending time with your family. God blessings on you on that you have a great time with your families, that you have safe travels. And I will see you next week in the season of Advent. God bless.